They told you they were heroes. They told you they created the world's greatest democracy. They told you they were selfless men who risked everything for your freedom. But what if I told you that story was never the whole truth? The version of history you were taught in school, the powdered wigs, the dramatic declarations, the fight for liberty, was only part of the picture. Behind the speeches and monuments lies a darker, more complicated story. One filled with secrets, contradictions, and truth so uncomfortable they were deliberately erased from textbooks. Not by accident, but by design. Because if you ever questioned their legacy, if you ever learned who they really were, you'd start to question everything this nation was built on. This is the truth about America's founding fathers they never wanted you to know. They say the American Revolution was a war for freedom. But for whom? In 1776, while Thomas Jefferson wrote the immortal words, "All men are created equal," hundreds of men, women, and children labored in bondage on his Virginia plantation, their backs scarred, their futures stolen, their humanity ignored. He didn't free them when the Declaration was signed. He didn't free them after the war. He didn't free them even in death. Instead, he wrote laws to preserve the institution of slavery and began a relationship with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings, when she was just 14 years old. This isn't the image of Jefferson that's carved into marble in Washington, D.C., but it is the truth, and he wasn't alone. George Washington, often glorified as the moral father of the nation, owned more than 100 enslaved people during his presidency. He signed laws to protect slaveholders. He signed laws to capture those who escaped. And he personally ordered the hunting down of Ona Judge, an enslaved woman who escaped his household to claim her freedom. Do you remember learning that in school? Most don't. Because the myth of the noble patriot, the selfless liberator, was easier to teach, easier to swallow. But the reality, it's much harder to face. America's revolution was never meant for everyone. When the Constitution was signed, 9 out of 10 Americans had no vote, no voice, no representation. Women were silenced. Native Americans were treated as obstacles. Black Americans were chained. And poor white men, without property, were irrelevant in the political system. So who exactly was this nation built for? The answer lies in the men who wrote its founding documents: wealthy, landowning, white, and in many cases desperate to protect their own power. They weren't just resisting a king. They were securing a new hierarchy, one where they sat comfortably at the top. And to do that, they needed more than just guns and soldiers. They needed a story, a myth that said they were freedom fighters, defenders of liberty, visionaries of justice. And once that myth took hold, it became the foundation of every history book that followed. But beneath that myth is a very different story. Let's talk about the compromises. When the Constitution was debated, there was a problem. Southern states had massive populations, but most of that population was enslaved. They wanted their enslaved people counted for representation, but not for taxation. So what did the founders do? They struck a deal, the 3/5 compromise. Each enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a person in the census, giving Southern states more seats in Congress without giving the enslaved any rights at all. Think about that. They didn't see Black Americans as full humans, but they still used their existence to gain political power. That wasn't a flaw in the system. That was the system, and it worked. For decades, Southern slaveholders dominated the government, the presidency, the Supreme Court, Congress. The very people who claimed to stand for liberty were crafting laws to protect slavery and punishing those who dared speak against it. Freedom for all? That was never the plan. Even Northern founders, the so-called moderates, often turned a blind eye. John Adams opposed slavery, but never made it a central issue. Benjamin Franklin once owned slaves before eventually joining the abolitionist cause, but only late in life, when his own wealth was already secured. What tied them all together wasn't just politics, it was class, preserving power, keeping the revolutionary chaos under elite control. They didn't trust common people to govern. That's why the Senate was originally appointed, not elected. That's why only landowners could vote. That's why the Electoral College was created, to make sure the mob never chose the president directly. This wasn't a democracy, it was a filtered democracy, rigged by design. But while they wrote laws to protect themselves, others paid the price. Let's talk about indigenous people. George Washington called Native Americans merciless Indian savages in the Declaration. Thomas Jefferson described them as barbaric obstacles to progress, and policies were shaped accordingly. Treaties were broken, lands were stolen, entire nations were displaced. The Founding Fathers didn't just ignore native sovereignty. They actively destroyed it. Their vision of America had no place for the people who lived here first. And that wasn't an accident. It was a foundation. While white settlers celebrated their new republic, native nations began centuries of forced removals, massacres, and betrayal. But they never tell you that, do they? You're told about the Boston Tea Party, not the broken treaties. You're shown images of Paul Revere, not the trail of tears that came after. Even the economic foundations of the new nation were drenched in exploitation. Take Alexander Hamilton, often portrayed as the visionary behind modern finance. He built the country's first national bank. He strengthened Wall Street. But in doing so, he tied the government's power directly to the wealth of elite merchants and bankers. His vision helped fuel the kind of corporate power that would later dominate American life. Railroads, factories, monopolies, all rooted in systems that ignored workers and exploited the poor. He wasn't just creating a banking system. He was locking in a future where the wealthy stayed wealthy and the poor stayed voiceless. So here's the truth. The Founding Fathers were not saints. They were not gods. They were not perfect men chosen by destiny. They were human, brilliant, yes, brave often, but also flawed, deeply. They created a system that claimed to represent the people, while excluding most of them. They declared liberty while enforcing slavery. They promised equality while protecting hierarchy. And for centuries, we were told only the good parts, only the polished quotes, only the marble statues. But history isn't sacred. It's honest, it's raw, and sometimes it's ugly. Yet by confronting the truth, we can begin to understand it. And in understanding it, we can finally tell the whole story, not to erase the founders, but to see them as they really were. And maybe, just maybe, become better than them. So if this truth challenged what you thought you knew, if it made you angry or opened your eyes, then share this, comment, subscribe, because history belongs to those who are brave enough to face it. And you're just getting started.